Okay, let's talk about Skagit lines. And we're going to talk about Skagit lines because that's the most commonly used line for winter steelhead. Listen, you can use a scanty line or a long belly line, or you can use a floating line. But the majority of us having the most success for winter steelhead are using Skagit lines. Now, generally, a Skagit line is 3 to 3.5 times the length of your rod. So if you have an 11-foot rod, you can do the math, or a 12-foot or 13-foot rod, you can do the math. Anyhow, they make them anywhere from 18 to 26 feet or something like that. The Skagit lines also are measured by grains. And so generally, there's a window on your rod. So if you look at your rod, it'll have a window of how many grains it's meant to cast. The heavier side of that grain window is usually the Skagit part of it. The lighter grain window is usually for the Scandi attribute. And real quick, with Scandi lines, they do make a polyleader that sinks, and they make different densities that sink, and those work fine for casting an unweighted fly. But once you start to get into big marabous, leadhead or bead-headed flies with rabbit on them, you need a significant line to turn over. In order to do that, an aggressive taper in a short length is the best model to do that. And so every modern Skagit line today is designed to cast a heavy fly and a heavy tip too. So how do you know which Skagit line works for you? Well, you look at the rod, you look at the grain windows, the heavier end of that grain windows is going to work. The truth be told is you could almost make any Skagit line work on any rod depending on how smooth or fast or slow you make the stroke in relation to the grain weights that you have. A lot of the time, I'll fish a medium length Skagit line with a 510, maybe a 540 for my 7 weight. But there are shorter lines that you can use, and you could drop that down to 420 to 480, and it's still going to perform quite well. Your local fly shop is going to have a recommendation for you when you go in and you buy a rod and a line for it. They're going to make the proper recommendation, and those guys are usually right on the money, so that's great. It's pretty easy to understand how the Skagit line works. The history is that it's a shooting head, and because it's a shooting head, it was designed just like the single-handed shooting heads, where they were designed to just like make one back cast and let her fly. And the Skagit lines are very similar. They're an aggressive, short tapered line where you make a back cast and let her fly. And so they're meant to strip back in. They're meant to shoot. And so they're just an aggressive shooting head. They attach on one end to a sink tip, and they attach on the other end to the running line. And so the back end of the fly line, which is the thickest part, attaches to your running line. There's different types of running line that go with the Skagit, and our favorite is a monofilament type of running line. There's different brands that work great. One of the things that you'll have to weed through in your running lines is what feels good to you, what can you hold on to. A lot of times our fingers get numb, and some of those running lines are a little bit slick. Your local fly shop can go over all the different benefits to those different types of running lines. Now we're going to talk about sink tips. It's a subject that probably equates to maybe success or not success depending on which sink tip you have on. There are times, especially in the early morning or the late evening and the magic hour, when you might have too heavy of a sink tip on because the fish will actually come in and lay pretty close to the shore. In high water, most people think that because the water's so high and so fast and turbid that we want to use the heaviest of sink tips, but that's not always true either. Sometimes you want to use a light sink tip when the water's high because the fish lay in such soft water right on the inside. What I've noticed is depending on what rivers you fish will determine what sink tips you use, and depending on the conditions too. I've been in Skeena country fishing shallow gravel bars, and I think maybe the fish sit on those shallow gravel bars because maybe they're hiding from the sea lions. I've fished the Sandy River in Oregon where the fish are laying in 2 feet of very soft water on the inside because the river is high and a little bit off color and raging. And I also have found that sometimes the fish are sitting 20 feet deep in the deepest, darkest places they can find because the water's so low and clear. And so we need to be able to make those adjustments with sink tips based on the knowledge we have at hand. And so my recommendation is to find a system that you understand and that you can relate to and that you could decipher easily. So those systems, let's just talk about a couple of the popular systems. I believe SA has the S system. Some of the old systems like Rio had were the type system. And then there's also the T system that Airflow and Rio have today. And so one of the most popular ones today is the T system. The T stands for tungsten, and the number behind it stands for how many grains a foot it is. A popular sink tip would be 7.5 feet at T14, or 10 feet at T10, or on and on. But I want you to understand that the higher the number, the more grains there is per foot, which means that T18 sinks way faster than T7. So that's easy to understand. The system I like to use is the flow system from Airflow. I like it because of the color-coded loops it has on the back end. They have a white loop, they have an orange loop, they have a brown loop and a black loop. Now what makes it easy for me to understand is, first of all, I know that they have T7, T10, T14, and T18. With those systems incorporated, the lightest color is the lightest sink tip, and the darkest color is the heaviest sink tip. So therefore, I can look at the orange and go, well, that's the second lightest one, that's the T10. Or I can look at the brown and say, that's the third in the lineup, that's my T14. The black is the darkest, obviously, so it's the T18, and the white would be the lightest at T7. And so all of those sink tips are between 10 and 12 feet. And all the flow tips from the Airflow system have 2.5 feet of intermediate leading into the rest of the sink tip. And so it's an easy system to learn, easy system to remember, and you can get to know anybody's system and they're all going to work for you. We just have to know that the more versatile that we are to match the conditions, the better. Let's talk about those conditions really quick. We want to meet the steelhead halfway. So hypothetically, if we're fishing a run that is 5 feet deep and the fish are laying on the bottom, we want to be 2.5 feet down. And so if you have walking speed water with decent amount of current, maybe a 10-foot tip, 7.5 feet at T14 might be the best bet. But how I know it's not is if I'm getting constantly hung up, the water's a little softer than I thought it would be, I would adjust to the T10, and if I'm not getting hung up, I'm probably perfect. Also, if the water's very low and clear, depending on the system that you're on, and all river systems are a bit different, but generally speaking, where we fish a lot, these fish tend to live very deep when the water's low and clear. And so I like to fish in the guts of those deep runs with a heavier sink tip. But as the water rises and gets off color and swells, the fish tend to live near the banks, and you can fish a much lighter tip during that time. Skeena country on main stem Skeena and the Kitimat, I've found that those fish lay in very shallow water, and so a T7 is probably a great choice. But in the same country, they're on like the Kalem River. It fishes a lot like our local rivers here. And when it's low and clear, those fish will be deep. And so you want to try to get deep in those particular places. I want to circle back to the types of sink tips there are. Rather than the T series, which is tungsten and a number after it, there's also the type series. And that type series is a type 3, a type 6, a type 8. And those sink tips, the way they're rated is a type 3 sinks at 3 inches per second, a type 6 at 6 inches per second, and a Type 8 at 8 inches per second. And generally those sink tips are in the 15-foot range.